Okay, the last battle, so called, of the Indian Wars, hardly qualifies as a battle. This was a wanton massacre. It seems that in the late 1880s, a sort of religious movement swept through the Plains tribes. Story goes there was an just ordinary Paiute Indian, nobody special, who got sick. He got really sick and he was delirious for a while. Now, when he came out of the delirium, he reported to the other Indians that while he was delirious, he'd seen visions where it was revealed to him what they should do to get everything back the way it had been. So he's suffering very great loss here. That they should make for themselves a certain type of shirt decorated with flowers and birds. And somebody just started the leaf, whatever it is out there. And while wearing the shirt, they do this dance. They dance and dance and dance till they're exhausted. Uh, by the way, it's called the ghost dance movement. Okay. Now, once they work themselves up into this state of heightened frenzy, miraculous things would occur. The shirt would, I used to say, would become bulletproof, something like that. Now, so how much peyote does it take to make that happen? The shirt would protect them, and the Indians would rise above the earth and hover above the earth like ghosts, ghost dance. And the surface of the earth would be covered by something sort of like sand or snow, and then eventually a wind would come and blow all that away, and all would be restored. The white men would be gone, the buffalo would return, the slain braves would rise from the earth. All would be as it had once been. Now, is that dangerous or is that pathetic? People who have a hard time in life often tend to live in their imaginations. Nonetheless, the Army is worried about this. I guess it might encourage them to do foolish things. So it's December 1890, I believe, when the Army troopers had rounded up about 400 Indians known to be involved in the ghost dance movement and took them to a cavalry post. And by the way, they should have been familiar with that. Once the buffalo's gone, this is pretty badly jumbled up. Indians would go to cavalry posts and get, moth-eaten blankets and stale food from the agent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Anyway, that's what you do when you're dependent. Um, so they camped out in a dry creek bed called Wounded Knee Creek near this cavalry post up in South Dakota. It's December in South Dakota. It is not balmy out there. Um, there's around 400 people in this dry creek bed. For unknown reasons, shooting broke out, and about half of these Indians were just mowed down. Probably the Army leaders ordered that they be disarmed. Wouldn't have taken much. I'm told they had very, very, very few actual workable firearms in their possession, the Indians, that is. But think about it. You're a Plains Indian. By far, your most treasured and necessary possession is that rifle. That rifle stands between you and your family and starvation. You have to have it. Are you just going to hand it to somebody in a uniform because they asked for it? Shooting breaks out. The troopers had just received shipment of two brand new Hotchkiss machine guns they were anxious to try out. So when the dust settled and the smoke cleared, about 200 men, women, and children had been mowed down. And that's Wounded Knee. So that's been a sore spot, and it deserves to be. So I don't whitewash things like that. Here's one that will make you sick. Prepare to reach for the Pepto Bismol. Let's put it in perspective. You ever heard of D-Day, the D-Day landings in Normandy in World War II? Like 3,000 Americans were casualties that day, but only four, four Congressional Medals of Honor were awarded for heroic acts performed on D-Day. That's partly because some bean counter said only one per unit. Should have been more. Now, the troopers who committed the massacre at Wounded Knee, over 24 Congressional Medals of Honor were dished out. Does that make you sick? It should. By the way, the unit that carried out that massacre was the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old unit. I cannot excuse them for thinking it was payback time. Okay, so The Indian Wars are over and the Indians have lost. Now, people in the United States proper knew very little about this. Their notion of Indians was kind of over romanticized, probably never seen one. The more educated ones had read the works of the French philosophe Jean Jacques Rousseau, who has the idea of the noble savage, that civilization is evil and we're corrupt because we've been raised in civilization. And if you could find someone unspoiled by that, they would be honorable and noble, the noble savage. That's kind of what the idea was. That didn't fit with reality. Anyway, they don't know what's being done to the Indians. They just don't know any more than later Americans would know how bad the situation was for African Americans in the South. Okay, there's a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson, a widow who remarried, and her husband moved her and the family out to Colorado. Not a good place for Indians, and she was shocked at what she saw with what being done with the Indians. Now, being apparently a fully qualified historian, she did a lot of research and discovered, as far as she could tell, the U.S. government had only made two kinds of treaties with Indians, and those were the ones we'd already broken and the ones we'd get around to breaking as soon as they became inconvenient. And she wrote a book about it, a very well researched book entitled A Century of Dishonor, published in 1881. The century was the first century of the United States after independence. The dishonor was our totally dishonorable treatment of the Indians. This became a bestseller, at least among the literate classes back east. People who read it were shocked as she had been. It led to a huge upsurge of demand for Congress to make this right, do right by the red man, try to undo all the wrongs that we've done. The result was a piece of legislation known as the Dawes Severalty Act. Dawes is Dawes. Severalty meant that we would be dealing with the Indians in severalty, that is, as individuals rather than as members of tribes, passed in 1887. So, Congress, bless their hearts, they try so bad, it's hard, and they screw it up so bad. Their solution was to turn the Indians into white men, to ask them to change their entire culture and lifestyle, to give up on being communal, nomadic people, and turn them into with the extended family setup to being uh, nuclear families living on farms and ranches. So, Dawes Severalty Act did away with the reservations. They were not restored until 1934. If you had taken all the land that was in the reservations and divided into that the number of Indian heads of household, they would have come out all right. But they didn't, because they gave each Indian head of household as much land as you could claim under the homestead law, 160 acres. Back east, that's a lot. Out in Wyoming or somewhere, that's not anything at all, hardly. Plus, they couldn't dispose of it for 10 years lest they be ripped off. If they wanted to be a rancher instead of a farmer, they could claim 320 acres. Most of the land that had been part of the reservations, however, is back available to be homesteaded by Anglos. So there you go. The Indian was not only defeated, he was forgotten, because the people in the United States turned their attention elsewhere. Well, we dealt with that. That's been taken care of, and so there you are. The situation among Indians themselves was whether to try to continue the old ways or to assimilate into white culture. Some went one way, some the other. Younger people leaned toward assimilation, and there were white people who were eager to help them out. There were schools set up for them, special schools. The most famous was the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, its goal being reacculturation. Okay? They'd get a civilized haircut and wear civilized clothes and learn English and all that. And of course, it sounds rough. I guess it was. What else could have happened? What else would have happened? And things like that in the past, if your ancestors went through very tough times, there's a way you can look at it. Most people don't seem to. Those ancestors of yours endured terrible, terrible things so that you could live the way you live now. Okay? Um, so, gradually it's going to move toward assimilation. In 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act restored the reservations. Um, and so then they still exist. And around 1970 or so, Richard Nixon practically went back to the dependent nations idea from 120 years earlier, that on reservation land only tribal law applies, federal and state law do not. And I have kind of a bit of a problem with that. I have a friend who lived in New Mexico for a while, said so much of New Mexico is reservation land that the state government is just barely getting enough tax revenue to get by. Oklahoma could kind of be in the same place. Now, some of these tribes are doing quite well, thank you. They got mineral rights, they got large scale agriculture, gambling casinos. Casino gambling is illegal in Oklahoma, but not on the reservations. Um, There are other tribes that are just where alcoholism is double the normal rate. There's child abuse, spousal abuse, neglect. It seems like the more help they get from the government, the worse off they are. That should be a lesson. So, Dawes Severalty Act 1887. There we are. This was part 3 of this, and I'm going to cut this off and see if I can find a way to get these things up on your site.